humble grain of wheat, preserved by fire several millennia ago, can, with modern science, unlock the story of our Bronze Age ancestors. Our ancient settled survival depended on the storage of food for challenging times. How they did that is unknown, but a project in UCD is attempting to answer that question.
The project is called FoodSec, and we're looking at food security in Bronze Age Ireland. The Bronze Age is a really interesting period in Ireland's past, which is starting just over 4,000 years ago. What's happening then is we see a significant increase in agricultural production. We see diversification in crops, so people growing different types of crops, more crops than the first farmers were growing.
We have a tendency to focus on things like metalwork, pottery, and even things like the burials from the period, but the settlement evidence is really quite rich from this time. And so the project wanted to look at what the settlement evidence is telling us, but specifically settlement's relationship to agriculture. So we're really looking at the idea of what sustained the level of settlement that existed at this time.
And what we start seeing is evidence for storage, more clear evidence for storage. And storage we interpret as archaeologists as the materialisation of surplus. Basically we can detect it archaeologically in excavations, and we can start saying, oh, these are people who are creating surpluses. And all of these are the kind of tenets you would expect in food security. They're things that are about managing risk in societies. And food security, of course, is something that's a huge global concern at the moment, but it has a very deep history as well.
So we want to look at it from different strands. So we're looking at it from an archaeological point of view, but also from a folklore point of view, so looking at more recent practices in the past, things that people would have done to help them store food before they ever had fridges, store food such as grain for sowing the year after, and then also so things like smoking meats, drying meats, marrow extraction, all the way that you could basically maximise your food, so both your seeds, your grain, so things like wheat and barley, and also your animal bone.
Those are grains of wheat, and that's the bean. And they come from an archaeological site, and they're preserved in the soil of the archaeological site, and we extract them and we identify them, and that's how we find out about how, like, the sort of things that people ate in the past.
So the main type of evidence, and it's the area that I work in most, is called archaeobotany. So archaeobotany is the analysis of plant remains that we recover from archaeological excavations. And analysing this material can tell us about what people were eating and what their local environments were like as well. So people are often surprised that these tiny little seeds and nutshell can survive. What happens most often is they survive because something has to have happened to them. So they're organic materials, otherwise they'll just rot. Most often what happens is because they become charred. So if you imagine you're eating your dinner and a bit of your dinner falls into the fire, some of it gets burnt. Once it becomes charred like that, it can survive in the ground for thousands of years until archaeologists dig it up again.
That's a grain of oat.
Jeez, how would you know that? That's crazy.
Just out of practice.
Yeah.
Long experience.
There was a boom in archaeological excavation in the last kind of 25 years. So we now have we have evidence for over 300 Bronze Age settlement sites across the country, which have been excavated extensively. While the Bronze Age has been studied quite a lot, the actual day-to-day farming aspects of it are still relatively new to the sort of our understanding of the overall way in which people lived.
Then there's all sorts of exciting techniques that are new in archaeological science that we can now apply to the kind of the stuff that we've looked at before, and we can ask new questions because we have new techniques and new ways of exploring the material now that we didn't have in the past. So there's all kinds of different answers, and different questions then come up from these answers. So.
Another thing that we're doing, which is quite different and hasn't been done much at all in Ireland, is stable isotope analysis. So what we're doing at this is looking at the chemistry of these charred cereal grains that we recover from the excavations, and looking in particular at certain stable isotopes in these compounds. We're looking at nitrogen and looking at carbon. By undertaking these chemical analyses in collaboration with colleagues at Oxford, who are one of the world leading labs for doing this analysis, we can start thinking about how people were farming. So for the nitrogen, by measuring the nitrogen 15 in these grains, what we can try and determine if manure was being applied. Manure is important to think about because that means people are farming in the one space. They're not just using up a patch of land, farming in it, exhausting it and moving on. It means that they're invested in that place. They're coming back, they're putting nutrients into the soil, working the soil and continuing to live and work in that area. So that's why we're interested in thinking about the nitrogen, and then the carbon can tell you about the amount of, I suppose, rainfall or irrigation in terms of the wetness of the crops.
Now we know a little bit about how this animal died. This is a pig bone, because if you see those lines on the bone, do you see that? Yeah. Those are cut marks. So this was someone's lunch.
So I'm a zooarchaeologist. That means that I study animal bones from archaeological sites. What drew me to this project was the possibility of exploring the preservation of food, of animal products. What were the mechanisms 3,000 years ago that allowed for people to have a meat-rich diet through the winter? So looking at those preservation practices. And we can imagine, quite quickly, like, oh, salting. But salt is a resource-heavy material to use. You would have to boil a lot of seawater constantly to get the amount of salt that you would need to preserve a cow or a pig or a sheep or two through the winter. So there must have been other mechanisms by which people were preserving meat through the winter. So what we're looking at are for evidence of smoking. In addition to smoking, also looking for evidence of grease extraction. So bones are good for lots of things, carrying meat, but also they have a lot of grease in them. And so if you can break down the bones and boil them for a long period of time, you can extract that grease, and you can use that grease to create an oxygen barrier and preserve food, meat, underneath the fat for longer periods of time.
Another one, I suppose, that we look at a lot is lipid analysis, which is basically the residues that are left behind on pots. And we've been doing a bit of work on Bronze Age material for that as well. And again, it does seem very much like they're using a lot of their pottery vessels for storing, especially milk products, predominantly milk, and but also probably heating it and maybe probably adding rennet and things like that, and kind of creating again like a sort of a fermented drinks, but also sort of a cheese-like material. So again, a way to keep the food for longer, so that they don't run short, essentially.
Maybe make your own bread from scratch. Maybe done it sooner than we think.
And this is called a quernstone, and this is what they would have used in the Bronze Age. So.
Incredible. And they would have just found these naturally,
Yeah.
like that shape they'd be looking for, isn't it?
One of the ways that it's suggested across Europe during the Bronze Age, in prehistoric Europe, how people are storing crops is in underground pits. And we see these beautiful examples in France and in Spain, and you also see them in Northern Europe as well. And I've always wondered how this would work in Ireland. And you can understand in a dry area like France or in Spain, how when you've got these dry soils and you've got these very nice solid walls in the pit, when you dig them, lower water tables maybe, how this might be a good way to store crops. And you think in Ireland, if you dig a pit, the wall of the side of the pit would start collapsing, the water table would come up. It just doesn't sound like a good way to do this.
So, like a lot of archaeologists have maybe hypothesized that pits that they find in Ireland, especially quite formal looking pits, like ones with these straight sides and flat bases and that kind of thing, maybe they were storage pits as well.
And then another area which is quite new is working with food scientists to try and understand when people are storing foods and cereals in particular, what happens to them. So how long can you store them for, in what kind of conditions, And we're trying to recreate and do some experiments based on archaeological evidence from the past to try and understand how effective these approaches would have been.
We do have heritage crop farmers who still grow traditional grains that would have actually existed during this period. So while a lot of crop is obviously modified for modern consumption, these are actually the grains that we are using and studying are actually traditional heritage crop grains.
My part of the project is twofold. Number one is to supply the grain, so harvest it, so basically thresh it, and it should be clean enough. And number two, to supply one of the sites to replicate the pits.
But the initial findings are interesting in that what we've tried is not just putting in dry grain, but also wet grain in some just experiments we've been doing so far, just the initial pilot ones before we dig the actual pits themselves, and putting them just in different kinds of vessels. And looking and seeing what may be happening is they're fermenting to some extent, and that might be something you want, because if you have a fermented product, it can be more nutritious, it can last for longer, and it might actually be something that people in modern societies could use as well. A very low-tech way of both storing and making your food more nutritious.
One of the other strains of evidence that we're hoping to incorporate into the project is the evidence from the folklife record that we have in Ireland. Now, Ireland has one of the biggest collections of modern ethnographic material. Part of the foundation of the state, we collected all this information about how people stored and, all aspects of rural life in up to the 1950s. Really, we have a huge collection of that. So, and we also know that our kind of cultural record is quite conservative. So maybe we can look at the things that they did in the more recent past and say, can we now kind of apply that to the past that's much further back, more ancient past, and see whether we can pick up things in that record that maybe we have missed before. So, so there's a lot of evidence, for example, in the folklife traditions of above ground storage. How would that survive in the past, in the archaeological record? How would that survive? How can we pick that up? What are the hints that maybe we have that those kind of techniques and practices were carried out in the Bronze Age as well? So this is an issue that we're still exploring. So this is what we've found. One of our partners is the Museum of Country Life in Mayo, and they've given us these images. So these are the images of the tradition. This is from, I think it might even be from the 50s, so it's very recent in Ireland, but it's sort of the stuff they've captured in the folklore collection. And these, what they did was they put briars on the ground.
We've had a few, I suppose, eureka moments or kind of light bulb moments where perhaps we've looked at, say, things like even more recent farming practices to do with grain storage and that through folklore and just some of the practices that we would never have been aware of in terms of overground storage of grain and how it was very successfully done in Ireland in the past.
Pigs and humans and bears all have different teeth in different parts of our mouth to do different things. So these teeth in the front are kind of sharp, kind of like this. Not as sharp though.
It's really rich grounds, and especially culinary archaeology is a field of specialty research that is growing. And there's been a collection of archaeologists that are really invested in it. And so I think that there's a lot of ways that we can approach thinking about the past and having a richer sense of it and understanding how we can then use the past for the present.
By doing this project, we're also helping Ireland to contribute to a lot of the broader, bigger studies that have been done across Europe, because up to this point, really, Ireland has been sort of excluded from an awful lot of the bigger European projects about crop and animal growth. So this is definitely a starting point in which we can kind of get Ireland into that narrative, and certainly if we are seeing things like the crops being used for processing, fermenting, like that's definitely a new step in our knowledge, because this isn't something that we've really considered before.
What I'm very keen on doing is trying to think about how material from the past can help us better understand the present and plan into the future. So that's something that I'm very passionate about, is trying to see how we can use this deep history of farming and understand how farming and why people were making certain food choices and conducting certain farming strategies thousands of years ago, and how that might help us understand how to structure farming better nowadays. It feels amazing that potentially we can contribute to something much bigger and be part of a much bigger conversation, and maybe have an impact to make environments and food systems better.